I stood on the edge of the train platform in Florence, my backpack digging into my shoulders, my heart pounding against a chest that once belonged to someone else's plans. "You'll never travel alone," she had told me, part warning, part prophecy. But as the train roared past and I saw my reflection in the window, strong, calm, free, I finally realized something. Being alone wasn't the same as being lonely. It was the first time in my life I felt like I belonged to myself. The promise that held me back. It started on a cold Sunday morning, the kind of morning that forces you to choose between comfort and courage. I remember sitting on the edge of the bed, my hands wrapped around a chipped coffee mug, steam rising into the still air of our small London apartment. Outside, the world was quiet, but inside, my heart was screaming for something more. "Promise me one thing," Daniel had said the night before, his voice gentle but laced with control. "You'll never travel alone. The world isn't kind to women who wander." He said it like he was protecting me, like he was shielding me from something dangerous, but deep down, I knew it was more about possession than protection. I nodded then, not because I agreed, but because I was tired of fighting. We had been together 8 years, and every argument about freedom ended the same way. His fear dressed as love, his control disguised as care. That promise became a prison I willingly stepped into. For years, I watched the world through photographs and stories of others. Friends who hiked mountains, strangers who watched sunsets in Morocco, women who stood fearless in the middle of foreign cities. I told myself I was content, that the life I had was enough. But the truth? I was disappearing, slowly, quietly. I worked at a travel agency, ironically. Every day I booked tickets for people who were chasing the dreams I was too scared to pursue. I'd smile at them across the counter and say, "Safe travels," even though my own life hadn't moved an inch. One day, a woman named Grace walked in. Silver hair, sunburned cheeks, the kind of eyes that had seen things you only dream about. She was 72, traveling alone. She placed her passport on the desk and said, "I want a one-way ticket to Bali." I blinked. "One way?" She smiled. "I've spent my whole life waiting for someone to go with me. Turns out I was the one I was waiting for." That sentence cracked something inside me. That night, I came home to Daniel's voice echoing from the living room. The same routine, the news, the silence, the unspoken rules. I stood in the doorway and watched him. The man I once thought was my future now looked like the reason I'd stopped having one. "Daniel," I said quietly. He didn't look up. "What is it?" "I booked a flight." Finally, his eyes met mine, cold, sharp, curious. "For who?" "For me." He laughed, the kind of laugh that slices through the air like glass. "You're joking." I shook my head. "Grace, a client of mine. She's going to Bali, alone. And I realized, I want to know what that feels like, to go, to breathe, to be me again." Daniel stood, his face darkening. "We talked about this. You can't just—" "I can," I said, surprising even myself. "I can." That night, while he slept, I sat in the kitchen under the dim light, my fingers trembling as I printed my e-ticket. Destination, Italy, Florence. The city I dreamed of since I was a girl sketching cathedrals in a worn-out notebook. When the paper came out of the printer, I stared at it for a long time, not because it was a ticket, but because it was proof that the promise he made me keep was finally broken. I folded it neatly, placed it inside my passport, and whispered to myself, "You'll never travel alone," he said. "Watch me," I replied. The sun was rising when I zipped up my bag and walked out the door. Florence, the city that spoke my name. When the plane wheels kissed the ground at Florence Airport, my heart was thundering so loudly that I could barely hear the pilot's announcement. I wasn't sure if it was excitement or fear, probably both. I had never traveled alone before. Every journey until now had been booked for someone else, planned to perfection but never lived by me. Stepping off that plane felt like stepping into another version of myself, one I hadn't met yet. The air was thick with the scent of espresso and warm bread from the cafes nearby. I clutched my bag tighter, my passport pressed against my chest as if to remind myself, "You did it. You're here." The taxi ride from the airport to the city center was a blur of terracotta rooftops, narrow cobblestone streets, and scooters that zipped past like impatient birds. Florence wasn't loud. It was alive. Every turn felt like the city was whispering something ancient and secret. When we stopped in front of my small rental apartment, I hesitated before paying the driver. This was it. No Daniel, no plans, no familiar voice telling me what to do or who to be. Just me. The building was old, its walls covered in ivy. Inside, my apartment had tall windows, a creaky wooden floor, and a tiny balcony that overlooked the street below. I set my suitcase down and walked straight to the window. The light hit the city like gold dust, warm, forgiving, and full of promise. For the first time in years, I felt free. I spent the first 2 days walking everywhere. No map, no agenda, just my feet and curiosity. Florence had a way of making you feel both small and infinite at the same time. I wandered through markets bursting with colors, ripe tomatoes, hand-painted ceramics, leather bags that smelled of craftsmanship and history. At the Piazza della Signoria, I sat on a bench and watched people move. Lovers holding hands, painters selling their art, tourists taking pictures of statues that had seen centuries pass by. I opened my notebook, the one I'd brought just in case I felt inspired, and began to write. What if being alone isn't loneliness? What if it's freedom dressed in silence? That evening, I found a small trattoria tucked away on a side street. The owner, an older woman named Sophia, greeted me like family. "You eat alone?" she asked, her accent thick but warm. I smiled awkwardly. "Yes. First time." She nodded knowingly. "Ah, first time alone is special. You listen to your heart better when no one else is talking." Her words hit me harder than I expected. As I ate homemade pasta under the glow of string lights, I realized how peaceful it was to simply exist without needing to fill the silence. I wasn't checking my phone, waiting for a message, or pretending to be fine. I was present. When I walked back to my apartment, the streets were quiet except for the sound of distant music, a violin echoing from somewhere near the river. I followed the sound until I found a young musician playing under the Ponte Vecchio bridge. His music was soft but aching, like a story told without words. I stood there for a long time, the night breeze brushing against my face, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of being alone. Later, as I leaned over my balcony watching the stars, I whispered to the city, maybe I wasn't meant to be half of someone. Maybe I was meant to be whole on my own. Florence didn't answer. It didn't need to. The way the night wrapped around me, warm and kind, was enough. The stranger who changed my journey. It happened on my 4th day in Florence, the kind of day that begins like any other and ends up rearranging the furniture inside your soul. I had planned to visit the Uffizi Gallery early, but something made me stop at a small cafe instead. It was the kind of place you'd miss if you weren't paying attention. No fancy sign, just the smell of roasted coffee beans and the quiet hum of locals chatting. I ordered a cappuccino and sat by the window watching people rush by. That's when I noticed him. A man about my age, sketching something in a worn-out notebook. His hair was silver at the temples, his clothes casual but neat, and his eyes carried a calm I hadn't seen in anyone for a long time. When he looked up, our eyes met. And just for a moment, time paused. He smiled first. "Tourist?" he asked in a soft, accented English. "Is it that obvious?" I laughed nervously. "Only tourists look up," he said, tapping his pen against the page. "Locals forget to see what's above their heads." I glanced out the window. The rooftops were glowing in the morning sun. "Then I guess I'll stay a tourist for a while." He introduced himself as Marco, an architect who sketched the city's forgotten corners. "People take photos," he said, "but sketches, they make you see." We ended up talking for hours about art, cities, loneliness, and the strange courage it takes to start over. I told him about my life back home, the years of giving everything to someone who never really saw me, the quiet dinners, the way silence became my companion. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he looked at me and said something that I still remember word for word. "Being alone doesn't mean you have lost. It means you've finally stopped pretending." Over the next few days, Marco became an unexpected constant. We'd meet at cafes, walk by the Arno River, or sit on the cathedral steps, sharing gelato while watching the world pass. He never flirted, never crossed lines. He simply existed beside me, the way sunlight exists beside shadow. One evening, as we watched the sunset from Piazzale Michelangelo, he turned to me and asked, "Why did you really come here?" I hesitated, staring at the horizon where the sky turned gold. "Because I needed to prove something." "To who?" My voice cracked. "To everyone who thought I couldn't live without them. To the people who called me fragile. To myself." He nodded slowly. "And have you proved it?" I didn't answer. But as I looked out over Florence, with its domes and spires glowing like embers, I realized something. I wasn't proving anything anymore. I was simply living. A few days later, Marco handed me one of his sketches, the cafe where we first met. Underneath it, he'd written, "For the woman who looked up." I smiled through tears. "You make it sound poetic." "It is poetic," he said softly. "You just didn't believe it yet." That night, I pinned the sketch to the wall above my bed. It wasn't just a drawing. It was proof that I could meet life halfway and be met with kindness. Florence was no longer just a city to me. It was a mirror, showing me the parts of myself I had forgotten to love. As I lay in bed, I thought of Marco's words again. Being alone doesn't mean you have lost. Maybe, just maybe, it meant I was finally winning. The journey south. The morning I left Florence, the sky was painted in pale pinks and soft gold, the kind of beauty that makes you question whether leaving is ever the right choice. But something in my chest whispered go, and for once I didn't argue with it. My suitcase rolled unevenly over the cobblestones as I made my way toward the train station. Marco had insisted on walking me there, though neither of us said much. Goodbyes, I realized, were hardest when they didn't need words. When the train whistle blew, he simply said, "Keep looking up." "I will," I promised. As the train pulled away, Florence shrank into a blur of rooftops and memory. I pressed my forehead against the glass, feeling a strange mix of loss and anticipation. I wasn't running away anymore. I was moving toward something, even if I didn't yet know what it was. I arrived on the Amalfi Coast just after noon. The first thing that hit me wasn't the view, though it was breathtaking, but the smell. Salt, lemon, and sunlight baked into the stones. The cliffs rose like sleeping giants above the sea, their edges softened by tiny houses painted in pastel dreams. I checked into a small guest house run by an older woman named Rosa, who greeted me with warm eyes and hands dusted in flour. "You travel alone?" she asked, rolling her R's in that musical Italian way. "Yes," I said. She smiled knowingly. "Then you will find yourself here." It sounded like something she'd said before, to hundreds of wanderers who had come and gone, but it still made my heart skip. That first night, I sat on the balcony overlooking the water. The sea was darker than I expected, almost black, and the stars hung low as if trying to listen. I thought of Marco, of the way he said solitude wasn't defeat, and I wondered if he'd meant it for himself as much as for me. A knock on the door startled me. Rosa appeared, holding a plate of pasta. "You shouldn't eat alone on your first night," she said. I smiled. "Thank you, but no excuses." She set the plate down and pulled a chair beside me. "Eat. Tell me why you came." I laughed softly. "Everyone keeps asking me that." "Then answer honestly," she said. So I did. I told her everything: the failed marriage, the years of shrinking myself to fit someone else's comfort, the way I woke up one morning and realized I didn't recognize my own reflection. When I finished, Rosa nodded slowly. "Ah, see. I know this story. Many women do." She looked out at the sea. "You gave your love to a man who didn't understand its worth. But love, amore, it must start again. With you." Her words lingered long after she left. The following days unfolded like pages of a new life. I hiked narrow trails that wound along the cliffs, my heart racing not from fear but exhilaration. I swam in the sea at dawn, the cold water shocking me awake. I spent afternoons in tiny cafes, sketching the coast the way Marco had taught me. And everywhere I went, I found small kindnesses. A fisherman offering me fresh oranges, a child waving from a balcony, a stray cat following me like a shadow. For the first time in years, I wasn't invisible. One afternoon, as I walked down to the beach, I noticed a group of women gathered near the water. They were older, their skin sun-kissed and wrinkled from laughter. And they were talking, laughing, living. One of them noticed me lingering nearby and waved me over. "Come sit," she said. "You're alone, yes? Then now you are not." I joined them, hesitant at first, but soon found myself laughing too. They told me about their lives: love, loss, husbands gone too soon, children who never called. Yet there was no bitterness, only warmth and humor. "Do you miss him?" one of them asked suddenly, tilting her head. "Sometimes," I admitted. "But I think I miss who I was more than who he was." The woman smiled gently. "Then find her again. The sea remembers every woman who ever needed to begin again." That night, as waves whispered against the shore below my balcony, I felt something loosen inside me, the last thread tying me to the woman who had been afraid to be alone. I picked up my journal and wrote, "Maybe solo doesn't mean lonely. Maybe it means whole." And for the first time in a long time, I slept without dreaming of the past. Letters to the self I lost. The rain came unexpectedly that morning, soft, silvery, and warm, like a sigh from the sky. The Amalfi Coast, usually bursting with sunlight, now lay quiet beneath a veil of mist. I sat by the window of Rosa's guest house with a cup of espresso in one hand and my old leather notebook in the other. For weeks, I had carried it everywhere, but never opened it. It had once been a journal for us, filled with sketches, to-do lists, and shared dreams. But that morning, I decided it would belong to me again. I turned to a blank page, hesitated, and wrote at the top in shaky handwriting, "A letter to the woman I used to be." And then, without planning, the words came pouring out like the storm outside. "Dear me, you thought love meant staying, even when it hurt. You believed silence was strength and patience was virtue. You forgave too quickly, trusted too deeply, and loved without keeping anything for yourself. But that's why I still love you. You were brave enough to hope, even when hope had teeth." As I wrote, tears blurred the ink. My hand trembled, but I didn't stop. "I know you're tired. I know you look at yourself and wonder where the light went. But please understand, breaking doesn't mean you're broken. It means you were human enough to feel everything." I closed the notebook and pressed it to my chest. For a long time, I just sat there, listening to the rain tapping softly against the glass, like an old friend reminding me it was okay to cry. That evening, Rosa found me sitting by the fire. She didn't ask what I was writing. She simply poured 2 glasses of wine and handed me one. "You have that look," she said. "What look?" "The one people get when they start forgiving themselves." Her words caught me off guard. "How did you know?" Rosa smiled knowingly. "Because I wrote my own letters once too." Over the next few days, I kept writing. Letters to the woman I used to be. Letters to the girl I never let dream. Even letters to the man who left. Not out of bitterness, but closure. One afternoon, while sitting by the sea, I wrote the hardest one yet. Dear future me, I hope you still wake up early to chase the sunrise. I hope you still laugh loudly and travel lightly. I hope you never again shrink to fit into someone else's shadow. And if you ever forget how far you've come, remember this: you are enough, even when you're alone. I tore the page from the notebook, folded it carefully, and let the wind take it. The paper fluttered above the waves before disappearing into the horizon. It didn't feel like loss. It felt like release. The next morning, I went down to the beach to watch the sunrise. The clouds had finally cleared, and the sky bloomed in shades of gold and lavender. I thought of all the versions of myself that had brought me here. The girl who loved too much, the woman who lost herself, and the traveler who was slowly finding her way back. I whispered into the wind, "Thank you." Not to anyone in particular, just to life itself. When I returned to the guest house, Rosa had left a small envelope by my door. Inside was a single line written in her elegant script. When you can look at your reflection and see peace instead of pain, that's when you'll truly be free. I smiled through tears, realizing I wasn't far from that moment anymore. That night, before bed, I wrote one last line in my journal. Healing isn't about forgetting who you were. It's about learning to love her again. And for the first time, I didn't just write it. I believed it. The stranger on the train. The sound of wheels against metal has a rhythm that reminds you life never really stops. It only changes tracks. That morning, I boarded the train from Salerno to Rome with my suitcase in one hand and a heart that finally felt a little lighter. The sun had just risen, spilling warm light across the coastline as the train curved north. I found an empty seat by the window, settled in, and pulled out my journal. There was something comforting about writing while moving, like the world was carrying my thoughts somewhere safe. That's when he sat across from me. He looked to be in his late 40s with graying hair that somehow made his smile look more sincere. He wore a well-worn leather jacket and carried only a small backpack. He nodded politely before setting down a camera bag at his feet. "Mind if I sit here?" he asked in a soft British accent. "Not at all," I said, returning the smile. The train jolted forward, and for a few quiet minutes we both watched the scenery blur by olive groves, distant mountains, and flashes of blue sea. I could feel his curiosity, the way travelers recognize each other not by destination, but by the questions they carry. "First time in Italy?" he asked eventually. I shook my head. "Second, but this time I came alone." His eyes lit up, not with surprise, but understanding. "Ah, the best kind of trip." I laughed lightly. "That's not what everyone says." He leaned back. "No, most people are terrified of silence. They fill it with noise people, plans, promises. But solitude tells you the truth." The words caught me off guard. For a second, I thought he could see straight through me. "What about you?" I asked. "Traveling alone too?" He hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Yes, always. After my wife passed, I thought I'd never travel again. But she used to say, if you stop exploring, you stop living. So here I am, living." His voice cracked slightly at the end, and I felt an ache in my chest. Not pity recognition. Two people, different losses, same emptiness slowly filling with light. Hours passed in easy conversation. We talked about art, food, books, and the strange ways strangers sometimes feel familiar. He showed me photos from his camera children chasing pigeons in Venice, an old woman hanging laundry in Sicily, a cat sleeping on a priest's bicycle. Every picture held a heartbeat. "You see beauty in ordinary things," I said. He nodded. "The ordinary is where life hides." When the train stopped at Rome, we stood awkwardly for a moment on the platform. Travelers rushed past us, a blur of voices and motion, but the air between us stayed still. "It was nice talking to you," I said. "Likewise." He paused, then added, "You have a light in you, you know, but you look like someone who hasn't realized it yet." I felt my throat tighten. Maybe I'm just learning to see it again. He smiled, adjusting the strap of his camera. "Then keep looking. The world has a funny way of reflecting it back." And with that, he disappeared into the crowd. That evening, I walked through the streets of Rome alone, yet not lonely. The city buzzed with life scooters darting through narrow alleys, music spilling from trattorias, laughter echoing off stone walls. I ordered pasta at a small restaurant and toasted my glass of wine to no one in particular. To myself. To the woman who once thought she couldn't stand on her own 2 feet. To the stranger who reminded her that healing isn't about replacing love. It's about rediscovering it in unexpected places. When I returned to the guest house later that night, I wrote a single sentence in my journal. Some strangers pass through our lives like trains. We don't need to chase them. We just need to thank them for the journey. And for the first time, the word alone didn't sound heavy anymore. It sounded like freedom. The bridge between worlds Paris greeted me not with romance but with rain. Not the soft, poetic kind you see in movies, but the relentless, soaking kind that makes you question every life decision, including why you thought solo travel in early spring was a good idea. My umbrella flipped inside out the moment I stepped out of the Gare de Lyon. I burst out laughing, soaked to the bone, startling a passerby who probably thought I'd lost my mind. But maybe I had lost something or someone and found myself instead. That realization felt like freedom. I checked into a small hotel near the Seine, run by a woman named Elise who wore red lipstick and spoke with the confidence of someone who'd seen everything and judged nothing. She looked me up and down, dripping rain onto her polished floor, and smiled. "Paris doesn't like umbrellas," she said. "It prefers surrender." "I think I just surrendered," I replied, laughing. "Bon," she said, handing me a key. "Then you'll do just fine." Over the next few days, I wandered without purpose through cobblestone streets that smelled of coffee and rain, past artists sketching by the river and lovers arguing softly in corners of cafes. I began to notice the beauty in the mundane again, the swirl of foam in a cup of espresso, the way old buildings leaned toward each other like they were whispering secrets. On my 3rd day, I found myself standing on the Pont des Arts, the bridge famous for its lovelocks. Thousands of them glittered along the railing, each one carrying a story, a promise, a memory. I ran my fingers across the cold metal, wondering how many of those promises were still true. I had no lock to leave, no name to carve beside mine. But for the first time, that didn't sting. I wasn't here to prove love existed between 2 people. I was here to prove it existed within me. As I stood there lost in thought, a familiar voice called out behind me, "Still chasing trains, or have you finally caught one?" I turned around, and there he was, the man from the train, the stranger with the camera. I laughed out loud, half in disbelief. "What are you doing here?" He lifted his camera. "Chasing light." "Of course." He walked over, rain dripping from his jacket. I thought I recognized that look, the one people have when they're about to forgive the world. I smiled. "I didn't think I'd see you again." "Neither did I," he said. "But then life has a way of surprising people who stop expecting." We walked along the river together, trading stories about where we'd been since the train ride. He told me about photographing hidden corners of Europe, and I told him about Rosa and her letters to the sea. He listened intently, the kind of listening that feels like safety. When we reached a small cafe, he insisted we sit. The waiter brought 2 glasses of wine and a plate of cheese. The city outside glowed under the rain, golden and shimmering, reflected in puddles like spilled light. "I used to think being alone was a punishment," I said quietly. "Now I think it's a privilege." He nodded slowly. "Solitude teaches you what company can't." "Like what?" That peace doesn't come from people, it comes from understanding yourself. We sat in silence for a while, the kind that felt easy. When I glanced up, he was taking a photo not of the city, but of me, laughing under dim cafe lights. "Why that moment?" I asked. "Because you weren't posing," he said. "You were being." When we parted ways that night, there were no promises, no exchange numbers, no talk of seeing each other again, just a quiet understanding that not every connection needs to last forever to matter deeply. Back in my room, I looked out at the rain-soaked city and whispered to myself, sometimes the universe doesn't send you love to keep it, sends it to remind you what love feels like. And that was enough. Before I slept, I wrote in my journal, Paris didn't teach me romance. It taught me peace. And maybe that's the most romantic thing of all. That night, for the first time, I didn't dream of anyone, not of him, not of the past. I dreamed of walking, freely, beneath an endless sky. The mountains remember everything. The train wound its way through the Alps like a silver thread stitched between clouds. Each turn revealed something almost unreal. Snow dusting the jagged peaks, lakes glimmering like glass, and pine forests breathing out thin curls of mist. It was beautiful, yes, but it was also quiet. Too quiet. I had grown used to cities whispering around me, streets humming with life, strangers brushing by, conversations spilling like music. But here, in the vast stillness of Switzerland, silence wasn't something you escaped. It was something you faced. I arrived in Lauterbrunnen, a valley so perfect it felt painted by a hand too generous with beauty. My small wooden cabin overlooked a waterfall that roared day and night, echoing through the valley like an ancient heartbeat. I could hear it even in my dreams. But with that beauty came a strange unease, the kind that creeps in when there's nothing left to distract you, not noise, not chaos, not people, just yourself. On my second night, I built a small fire and sat outside with my journal. The stars were impossibly bright. I wrote, I thought solitude was freedom, but what if it's also a mirror? Because that's what the mountains did. They reflected everything back to you, your fears, your regrets, the things you thought you'd left behind in crowded train stations and airport gates. I remembered my mother's voice, faint but clear from years ago. You'll never travel alone. I had always taken that as a comfort, but tonight it sounded like a challenge. The next morning, I decided to climb. A local guide had offered to take me up a nearby trail, but something inside me insisted I go alone. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the same reckless courage that had brought me this far. The path was steep and slick from melting snow. My breath came in shallow bursts, my heart pounding against the thin mountain air. With every step, my thoughts grew louder. What if you fall? What if no one finds you? What if being strong just means being too afraid to admit you're lonely? At one point, the trail narrowed, and I froze. Below me, a sheer drop. Above, only fog. My knees trembled, but I couldn't go back. So I closed my eyes, and I said it out loud this time, what I'd never dared to before. I'm scared. The wind didn't answer, but something shifted inside me. The fear didn't vanish, but it became smaller, manageable, almost like a companion rather than an enemy. When I finally reached the ridge, the clouds parted. The entire valley unfolded beneath me, drenched in light. I fell to my knees, tears mixing with sweat and snow. I wasn't crying from fear anymore. I was crying from awe. That's when I noticed something glinting near a rock, an old brass compass, half buried in frost. I picked it up, brushing the dirt away. It didn't point north anymore. The needle spun in circles, lost and free. I laughed through my tears. Just like me, I whispered. I kept it, not as a tool for direction, but as a reminder. Sometimes the point isn't to know where you're going. It's to keep moving anyway. That night, back in the cabin, I wrote another entry. Today I climbed a mountain. But more than that, I faced the parts of myself I used to run from. The silence didn't break me. It introduced me to someone I'd never met before. Me. I fell asleep to the sound of the waterfall, steady and eternal, and I dreamed not of running or searching, but of standing still, rooted, whole. Letters to the woman I used to be. The morning light spilled through the cabin window, touching the wooden walls with warmth that felt almost human. Outside, the waterfall still roared, but inside there was a stillness that finally didn't feel empty. It felt earned. I made myself tea, the kind that tasted faintly of honey and earth, and sat by the window with a stack of unused postcards I had collected throughout my journey. From Paris cafes, Spanish plazas, Italian vineyards, and now this quiet Swiss valley. For a long while, I just stared at them. Each postcard carried a memory, but not just of a place, of a version of me that had existed there, a woman who smiled for strangers but avoided mirrors, who ran from pain by boarding planes, who chased sunsets because she didn't know how to sit through the dark. I took the first card and began to write, not to anyone else, but to her, the woman I used to be. Dear me, I know you're scared. You think if you stop moving, the sadness will catch up to you. But here's the truth. It already has. It's just been traveling with you, hiding in your luggage, whispering between the pages of your passport. You think you have to prove something, that being alone means you've failed. But solitude isn't punishment. It's an invitation. It's where you meet the version of yourself that doesn't need to be chosen to feel complete. You don't have to earn rest. You don't have to chase love. You just have to stop running from yourself. With love, me. I stared at the postcard for a long time after I finished. The words blurred behind tears. Not the sharp, aching kind, but the soft kind that felt like release. I wrote another one, then another. To the girl who stayed in a relationship because she feared being alone. Loneliness inside love is far heavier than loneliness outside it. Leave. You'll survive. To the woman who thought her dreams expired at 30, you are not behind. You are becoming. The world doesn't move in straight lines, and neither do you. To the mother who never became one, you still nurture life. In friendships, in kindness, in courage. Creation wears many faces. By the time the sun dipped behind the mountains, the table was covered in postcards, dozens of them, all addressed to the same name, me. I didn't plan to send them anywhere. They were meant to stay right here. Little pieces of truth scattered across the places I had healed. That night, I walked to the edge of the valley where the waterfall met the river. I tore one postcard into small pieces. The first one, the letter to the woman who ran from herself, and let the pieces drift into the water. They swirled and disappeared into the current, carrying my old fears with them. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was saying goodbye. I felt like I was saying, thank you. Thank you to the girl who didn't give up, even when she didn't know where she was going. Thank you to the woman who kept walking, even when she was lost. Thank you to the one who learned that solitude doesn't mean silence. It means space to finally hear your own voice. The next morning, I looked at the stack of postcards I hadn't destroyed. I tied them together with a thin red ribbon and wrote on the top one, "Letters to the woman I used to be, found along the way." Maybe one day I would turn them into a book. Maybe they would find their way to someone who needed them more than I did, because that's what healing does. It echoes. The journey comes home. The taxi rolled down familiar streets I hadn't seen in years, and yet every corner whispered memories. The corner cafe where I used to sit after long shifts, the bookstore with the cracked wooden door, the park where laughter had once echoed. I had returned, not the same woman who had left, but someone who had collected herself along foreign shores, someone who had learned the language of her own heart. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. The boxes I'd sent ahead had arrived, but the echoes of my absence lingered in the air. I set my suitcase down and paused, letting my fingers brush against the old wooden banister. So many times I had imagined this moment, the triumphant return, the tears, the apologies. Yet reality was different. I didn't crave their approval anymore. I didn't need it. I unpacked slowly, placing souvenirs, letters, and photographs from my travels on the shelves. Each item told a story. The time I danced under the Eiffel Tower, the sunrise in Santorini, the strangers who became friends in Venice. The world had expanded, but more importantly, I had expanded with it. Then the phone rang. It was a familiar number. My son. I hesitated. His voice, when it came, was shaky, uncertain. "Mom, I heard about the apartment, about the will. I didn't realize." I didn't let him finish. "Son," I said, my voice calm but firm, "I am not here for your approval. I am here because I chose to continue my story, with or without your understanding." There was a pause, a crack in his tone, a hint of realization. Perhaps he understood finally that wealth wasn't merely monetary. Perhaps he saw that the real treasure was the courage and self-respect I had reclaimed, that the journey of a woman who thought life had ended at 50 had begun anew. I walked to the window, looking out at the city lights twinkling like stars. The streets were the same, yes, but I was not. I was richer, not in money alone, but in experience, resilience, and the quiet, unshakable knowledge that my worth was mine to define. In that moment, I understood the final truth of my journey. Home is not a place you return to. Home is the woman you've become. I smiled, letting the memories and lessons wash over me. My life, once paused by fear and doubt, was now a story in motion, and I was the author. The chapters ahead were unwritten, limitless, and finally, mine. The past had shaped me. The world had tested me, and now I was unstoppable. The unexpected letter. A week after settling back home, I found a letter slipped under my door. It was from Martha, the woman who once told me, "You'll never travel alone." Her handwriting was shakier than I remembered. "I watched your journey online," she wrote. "I was wrong. You found something I never dared to search for, yourself." For a moment I couldn't move. My heart softened. All those years of silent resentment, the anger that she didn't believe in me, it began to melt away. I realized that sometimes people speak from fear, not cruelty. That evening I wrote back, "Solo doesn't mean lonely, it means whole. I wish you the same peace I found." And just like that, the last wall between who I was and who I'd become finally crumbled. The invitation. A local university invited me to speak about finding courage after 50. I laughed at first. Me, a speaker? But then I remembered the train platforms, the airports, the strangers who shared their stories with me. Maybe it was time to give something back. Standing on that stage, I looked at the faces of women who looked exactly like I once did. Tired, scared, invisible. I told them, "You don't need permission to live. You just need to start packing, whether it's your suitcase or your regrets." When the crowd stood and applauded, I didn't feel proud. I felt useful. My story wasn't just mine anymore. It had become a map for others. The man in Lisbon. A year later, during a visit to Lisbon for a travel event, I met Daniel. He wasn't like anyone I'd met before, quiet, kind, carrying his own scars with grace. We shared coffee by the ocean, laughter under lanterns, and stories that felt like they'd been waiting decades to be told. But when he asked, "Would you ever travel with someone again?" I smiled. "Maybe," I said, "as long as we both know how to walk alone too." For the first time, I realized companionship wasn't about filling a void. It was about walking side by side, freely. The Book of Roads. Back home, I began writing my story, not for fame, but for legacy. The pages filled with memories, the markets in Marrakesh, the loneliness in Venice, the laughter in Prague. I titled it The Book of Roads. Publishers called. They said it was raw, beautiful, and brave. But the truth was simple. It wasn't bravery that carried me across the world. It was heartbreak, transformed into motion. The day I held the first printed copy in my hands, I whispered, "This is for every woman who thought she needed someone to begin." The horizon. Within years later, on a calm morning, I walked to the beach, the same place I once stood terrified of being alone. The sun rose slowly, painting the sky with gold and pink. I closed my eyes, letting the sea breeze kiss my face. The voice in my head, once filled with doubt, now whispered peace. Life had circled back, not to where it started, but to where it finally made sense. She said, "You'll never travel alone," I murmured. But look at me now. I never really was. Because everywhere I'd gone, the laughter, the tears, the miles, they had built the woman who stood here today. Strong, soft, unafraid. The waves rolled in, washing the shore clean, just as life had washed me. Not empty, but renewed. And as I watched the horizon blur into light, I realized the final truth. You're never truly alone when you travel within yourself. Final line, for preview quote or trailer text. I didn't need anyone to hold my hand. I needed to hold my own heart.